We're here to ask and address through reading and conversation tonight, I think, what may be the most essential question for artists and for human beings, and that is, how can we be both alone and together? How can we discover and express our essential selves? How can we find solace in the quiet hours without the white noise of solipsism? And how can we find comfort in connection without the petty lies and mean compromises that so often characterizes the worst of commonality? There are two quotations from Emerson that I think get to these tensions between solitude and community. Emerson said that he who should inspire and lead must be defended from traveling with the souls of other men, from the daily time-worn yoke of their opinions. And yet he also said that the soul environs itself with friends, that it may enter into a grander self-acquaintance or solitude. And so he's really, I think, gotten to the question that we're here to pursue tonight, which is that it's very easy for us to be stifled and put upon, and we need space, and we need openness, and we need to let our souls breathe. And of course, Emerson is one of our great spokesmen for the self, and as this precious unit to be dignified. And yet he's also saying that the self doesn't really exist in its highest form except for with connections with other people. And it's very puzzling to me about how we actually bring these paradoxical principles into our everyday lives, and how we frame the essential questions around them, and also come up with tentative, practical, and even spiritual answers to these questions. I come tonight as a curator and also as an author of a book on creative pairs and collaboration, and I'm discovering over and over and over again that works that I associate with an individual lone artist have in fact been the product of mutuality, of actual collaboration, sometimes that is named, but one part of the collaboration that dropped off, sometimes of a more complicated dynamic of mutuality that we would not give the name collaboration, but nevertheless is absolutely essential to the creative product. We're coming to this program from a working session for Penn members this afternoon, and one of our guests at that session, Anna Schulite, who's a painter and an advisor to Arts and Mind, brought this passage from a memoir of Picasso's third wife. Anna, what was her name? I won't repeat that, but it's in the record, and it's this long, torturous passage in which she describes the process of getting Picasso out of bed in the morning. And it involves, I think she uses the image of a train. It involves 3 people. It involves 2 servants, and then the author of this memoir, bringing up the rear, and it goes on and on and on. It goes on so long, in fact, that Anna became chagrined and did not continue the passage in which, they are wrestling with his, very aggressive, intensely verbal protestations that life is meaningless, not worth living, he's not lovable, and that there's no point. And apparently she describes this in detail as though it's one day, but apparently this was the daily ritual, and it's just one intensely vivid example of, of what I alluded to before as a dynamic of mutuality, a way in which, this artist, his work literally would not have happened if it weren't for these relationships, which have their elevating aspects, and also it's kind of depressing because he, it comes off like, a big baby. being babied by these strong women in his life. But enough of the historical examples. We are enriched tonight and blessed to have three great authors from three corners of the world here to discuss with us their experience with these questions in their own way. We're going to hear from each of them in turn. I'll introduce them, and then we will all engage in a conversation. I know there are many artists in the audience, and all of you, I think, all of us as human beings, regardless of how we spend our days, can, I think, speak to these central questions. And I also, at some point, will be bringing in the voice of my collaborator in Arts and Mind, Dr. Gerard Fromm, who's the director of the Erickson Institute for Education and Research at the Austin Riggs Center. Jerry is a psychoanalyst at Riggs, which is very interested in these questions because they treat very seriously mentally ill people with a very strong emphasis on community. And Jerry himself runs something called the Creativity Seminar at Riggs every summer that is devoted to exploring these links between psychology and creativity that is intricately interconnected with Arts and Mind. And I'll be reading some notes that Jerry sent from his sick bed. We're very sorry that he couldn't be with us in person. Okay, so on to the program. We're going to hear first from Kjersti Skomsvold. I'm not pronouncing her name correctly, but she has given me permission to mangle it. And perhaps if you coax her, she will say it in beautiful Norwegian. But I did not have enough practice with the voice coach to be able to say it correctly. Kjersti is a Norwegian. Well, let me just name all of our guests, and then I will do an extended introduction for Kjersti. We're also joined by Lewis Hyde to my left, and by Kyung-Sook Shin, who is joined by her translator, Deborah Baum. So we'll hear from each of these folks in turn, and then we'll get to conversation. So to introduce Kjersti, she is a Norwegian writer from Oslo, and she made her literary debut in 2009 with a novel whose English translation is The Faster I Walk, The Smaller I Am. This is a wonderful book. It's soon to be available from the Dalkey Archive Press in the United States. Very funny, very quiet, full of lovely searching about an old woman fumbling her way out of grief and loneliness. This book was nominated for the Norwegian Booksellers Prize and won the Tarjei. Thank you. First book prize. It will also be produced as a play by the National Theatre in Oslo in 2012 and is scheduled to appear in English, as I mentioned, and also in Danish, German, Spanish, and Swedish. So please give a warm welcome to Kjersti Skomsvold.
And I actually had to go to a speech therapist for some years to learn how to say my own name. So, yeah, Kjersti is what we say in Norwegian. Speak up. Yeah. I had to go to a speech therapist for some years to learn how to say my own name. So, no wonder it was hard for you. Yeah. Yes, I will tell a bit about how I wrote my book. My plan in life was to be a computer engineer, and for some years all the writing I did was in programming language. Fortunately, life doesn't always turn out the way we plan. And maybe all we want in life is a sorrow so big that it forces us to become ourselves before we die. I got ill, and I had to move home to my parents and live in their basement. My father says that I have to stop calling it a basement. We had a whole ground floor decorated for you, he says. But I think it sounds more sad and literary when I call it a basement, and people want their writers to be miserable. I was very lonely those years and scared. When I was lying there, looking up at the ceiling, I started to think about death. and I wonder if the inevitable loneliness of being human is due to the fact that when we die alone. I didn't have studies, friends, a boyfriend, or any of the activities I used to have to define myself. So in desperation, I decided to write a novel. I needed something very concrete to identify with. And I thought that if I became a writer, I would start to feel like a human being again. A novel has to be written by a human, I thought. Even louder? Oh. You don't have any mics around here?
I'm afraid we're not mics, so...
Oh, I'll try to speak even louder. Yeah. A novel has to be written by a human, I thought. Can you hear me now? No? Is it possible to take
I don't know. Is there someone who's helped set up the room who can tell us? I know that we certainly could get closer if folks would move down. I apologize that we're not.
They're working on it.
I will see if this table can move. Okay.
This is not. Thanks. It wasn't something.
Sit forward. Okay.
All right. That's nicer.
A couple seats in there.
I assume that everyone who's in the back was hearing okay. Well, could you come? Because there are plenty of seats up front. If you wouldn't mind, let's just get intimate. Well, I think that she's doing. I understand. I think she's at the top of her range. So those of you who are having trouble hearing, please join us in the front if you like. And
yeah.
Let's go again. All right.
Much nicer.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So, should I just continue where I left off? Yeah. I thought that a novel has to be written by a human. I started to write about this old and lonely woman, Mattea, on post-it notes that I put above my bed. I didn't read a lot of books nor write anything previous to this, and I'm glad I didn't know how hard it is to write something of quality, because then I probably never would have tried. I had to rewrite my novel several times before I found my literary language, Mattea's language, and I have been thinking about how to become a human being out there in the world has been connected with developing my language. As my writing got better, so did I. I could do more, and so could Mattea. She isolated herself because she was very scared of other people, and she's the image of solitude. But when the only person in her life, her husband Epsilon, dies, she's struck with the fear of dying herself before anyone knows that she has lived. So, to overcome her fear of death, she has to overcome her social anxiety. After 2 years of writing all by myself in the basement, I attended creative writing schools for 2 years. I was surrounded by people who cared about words and sentences. So these years were perhaps more like being in a bubble than out in the real world. It was of great importance to me to have some very good writers and readers as teachers. And there are still some of them I picture when I'm writing now. Then the book was published, and these past 2 years, Mattea and I have been out in the world. We have come all the way to America, and I'm still a bit puzzled by how that could happen. I have learned that loneliness is a necessary refuge. or maybe solitude is the right word, because I'm not sure if lonely is the right way of describing how I felt when I lived in the basement. Because that's the amazing thing about writing. You realize that just you are enough. There are days now when I wake up and instead of saying to myself, live, seize the day, I say, as a survival technique, everyone I know and love have died. Then I feel much better and free enough to do some writing. Yeah, so maybe that's the advice I have. I'm allowed to give advice now that I'm sort of on a panel. Yeah. And then I thought maybe I could read a chapter from a novel, which is about loneliness, about Epsilon seeing Matea in her loneliness and maybe being willing to share it, sort of. Yeah. Are you hearing me now? Yeah. Okay. The chances of being struck by lightning twice in the same spot are less than epsilon, if epsilon equals a microscopically small quantity, was the first thing Epsilon said to me. It's completely unbelievable. He didn't know how truly unbelievable it was, because nothing had ever singled me out. The spun bottle never pointed at me, the neighborhood kids never found me when we played hide and seek, and I never found the almond in the pudding on December 23rd. One or the other of my parents always found it, which was almost a bit suspicious. It was a cloudless day. I was standing by myself in a corner of the schoolyard and trying to look busy counting rocks. You're only fooling yourself if you think you can't be lonely just because you're busy. But the most important thing is that no one else thinks that you're lonely. While I was standing there, dark clouds suddenly rushed in, the heavens opened up, and bolts of lightning struck me in the forehead twice. I fell back and everything was dark and very far away. I could hear ambulances, and this time I knew they were coming for me. Two men in white jackets came into view. They put me on a stretcher and carefully lifted me into the ambulance, as if I was someone they cared about. Then we drove away, sirens blaring, and it was as beautiful as Beethoven's Fifth. Everyone at the hospital was attentive and kind. The nurses looked at me compassionately and said that it probably wouldn't take too long for my eyebrows to grow back. The other patients were also nice. It seemed like getting struck by lightning earns people's respect, as if we lightning survivors are God's chosen, kind of like Moses. You were so lucky, the doctor said, and I felt lucky. I only cried whenever I looked at myself in the mirror and when I had to go home. During my stay in the hospital, I practiced what I would tell the other students, who would surely flock around me when I came back. I've never experienced something so painful, I said. The doctor said it's a miracle I survived. They'd all gasp and thank God that I was still alive. I practiced hiding my scorched eyebrows with my hands so that it looked natural, either by placing a forefinger over each of them, like the sign language for ox, or I could pretend I was shading my face from the sun. I've gotten so popular, it's really starting to wear me down, I tell my mother and father, who couldn't be more proud. But when I went back to school, my Moses complex had disappeared, because the news on everyone's lips was that the Crown Prince was back from London after the war. During first period, the teacher forgot to call my name, like always. But instead of saying, Matea, here, to myself like I usually did, I raised my hand. Excuse me, I said, but I have returned. The lightning had apparently given me a positively charged dose of self-confidence. The teacher lifted his face from the attendance list that lay in front of him on his desk. The other students turned around and stared at me where I sat in the back row, and I laid my hands over my scorched eyebrows and pretended I was shading my face from all the attention. The teacher had to think a minute, but finally he remembered me. Oh, we thought, Then he didn't say anything more, and everyone turned back around towards the blackboard, and during recess I was alone counting rocks again. I'd reached 177 when I saw two big ears coming my way from across the schoolyard. It was the skinny boy we called Trophy Cup. He was in the same grade as me, and I knew I was the one he was heading toward, because I was alone within a radius of 20 meters. I was always alone within a range of 20 meters, sometimes more. He walked with determination, as though he was afraid he'd change his mind if he hesitated. I got nervous and started counting rocks faster and faster, and I tried to look surprised when he stopped beside me and cleared his throat like he was about to give a speech. The chance of being struck by lightning twice on the same spot must be less than epsilon if epsilon equals a microscopically small quantity, he said with a serious expression on his face. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything at first, but then I remembered my missing eyebrows, so I made the sign of the ox. I moved so that it would seem more natural. He had innocent eyes, and I thought he wasn't the type who tears the legs of spiders or cuts earthworms in two to see if the parts will become two new ones. I wonder how you were doing, and I'm relieved to see you on your feet again, he said. And you know, you look good without eyebrows. It makes your face so open. At first I was embarrassed, but then I realized this was the first time someone had lied to make me feel better. Thank you, I said and dropped my hands. I think you look good with big ears too. Well, he said, they're not so bad. It's just unfortunate they get cold so easily. Yes, that's unfortunate, I said. But in any case, he said, if you don't mind, and if it's not too hard on you, I'd like to hear what it was like to be struck by lightning, and I can even show you some probability calculations I've done about your experience. It really is unbelievable. I'd like that, I said and smiled. He smiled too, then turned to go. He took 2 steps, hesitated, and then looked back at me. You know, Mattea, he said, if you count both big and small ones, there are 345 rocks here. I counted them yesterday.
Thank you, that was beautiful. When is your book out in English? Do you know?
Soon, I think, but I'm not quite sure exactly when. Yeah.
Watch for it. The faster I walk, the smaller I am. Thank you very much. It's beautiful. Our next presenter is Kyung-Sook Shin. She is the author of many works of fiction and is one of South Korea's most widely read and acclaimed novelists. She's been honored with the Manhae Literature Prize, the Dongin Literature Prize, and the Yisang Literary Prize, which all may have pronunciations different from the way I've just read them, as well as, oh no, yet another one in yet another language. Please help me out.
No, just make a fool of myself.
As well as France's Prix de la Passe. I believe that's correct. Please Look After Mom, which has just been published this year, is her first book to appear in English and will be published in 19 countries. It's a beautiful book, and I'm very glad to welcome Kyung-Sook Shin and her translator, Deborah Fromm.
Please Look After Mom은 엄마에 대한 이야기입니다.
The book Please Look After Mom is a story of our mothers.
어느 날 갑자기 아주 번화한 서울이라는 기차역에서 엄마를 잃어버리게 된 그런 이야기입니다.
So one day in a very busy city, in very busy station in Seoul, the daughter loses her mom.
You could amp it up a bit.
Oh, good, okay.
Yeah.
엄마를 잃어버리고 나서 그 가족들이 그 엄마를 찾아다니는 그런 소설입니다.
So the story is basically about a family who loses their mom, and the family is looking for this mother.
이 소설은 구성이 좀 특이하게 되어 있습니다.
This novel is structured quite uniquely.
지금부터 낭독해드릴 장면은 엄마를 잃어버리고 나서 딸이 그 엄마에 대한 이야기를 하는 장면입니다.
So the scene that I'll be reading right now is right when the mother is lost, the daughter is looking for her, and it's the part where she is thinking out loud.
그런데 낭독할 때 이렇게 들어보시면 알겠지만 나는이라고 되어 있지 않고 자꾸 너는 이렇게 들릴 겁니다.
And when I'm reading this, you'll realize, but she is referred to not as me or I, but she is referred to as you.
이 소설 자체가 엄마를 잃어버리고 난 다음에 네 개의 목소리가 들리는 작품입니다.
And the story is divided into 4 parts, and it is in 4 different voices.
딸은 너는이라고 되어 있습니다.
So the daughter, as I said before, she is referred to as you.
아들은 그는이라고 표현됩니다.
And the son is referred to as he.
그리고 이 딸과 아들의 아버지 그리고 이 실종된 엄마의 남편분은 아버지는 당신이라고 표현됩니다.
And the husband is referred to as him.
그리고 마지막에 엄마가 등장하는데 엄마만 나는이라고 말합니다.
And the last part is the voice of the mother, and only she is referred to as I.
그렇게 한 것은 엄마라는 존재가 아들과 엄마 사이 혹은 딸과 엄마 사이 또 남편과 엄마 사이 한 시선으로서만 다 얘기할 수 없는 부분들이 남아서 이렇게 복잡하게 했습니다.
And the reason why I did it this way is because the mother cannot be explained just through the relationship between the daughter or the son or through her husband. Therefore, I made it a little confusing like this.
그리고 엄마라는 존재가 나는이라고 말하면서 사는 시간보다 그 나를 여러 자기와 관계를 맺고 있는 여러 존재에게 다 나눠주면서 사는 존재라고 생각했기 때문에 이 소설 안에서는 반대로 엄마만 나는이라고 말하게 했습니다.
And another reason why I also just refer to the mother as I is because the mother in Korean culture is not her own self. She is always related to as the daughter's mother or the husband's wife, and never as her individual, or she does not have her own individual character. Therefore, I wanted to give her the mother the opportunity to become an individual.
제가 지금 낭독할 부분은 이 소설의 첫 부분입니다.
So the part that I'll be reading right now is the very first chapter of this book.
낭독할 때 제가 엄마라는 발음을 많이 할 것인데 그것은 마음 이런 말입니다.
And when I read this first chapter, I'll be referring to the mother just as mom.
한국어가 음악처럼 들리겠지만
I'm sure the Korean will sound a little like music.
엄마라고 말할 때 맘이구나 이렇게 들어주세요.
So whenever you hear me say 엄마, just know that that means mom in Korean.
이 책을 읽는 동안에 개인적인 작가로서의 바람이 있다면 책 속에서는 엄마를 잃어버린 걸로 시작이 되지만 이 책을 읽으면서는 그 잃어버린 엄마, 진짜로 잃어버리지 않았어도 잊어버리고 살고 있거나 했던 그 엄마가 자기 마음속으로 들어오는 그런 경험을 했으면 좋겠다고 생각합니다.
So as the writer of this book, the only hope that I have for you readers is that, of course, I'm sure not everybody's mom's really lost like in this book, but if your mother is somewhat lost in your heart, I hope that by the end of this book you are able to find her once again.
제가 한국어로 짧게 읽고 오신 분들이 편하게 영어로는 조금 길게 낭독해드리겠습니다.
So for the convenience of the audience, I'll be reading a shorter excerpt in Korean, and I'll be reading a much longer version.
엄마를 잃어버린 지 일주일째다. 오빠 집에 모여있던 너의 가족들은 국립 끝에 전단지를 만들어 엄마를 잃어버린 장소 근처에 돌리기로 했다. 일단 전단지 초안을 짜보기로 했다. 옛날 방식이다. 가족을 잃어버렸는데 그것도 엄마를 잃어버렸는데 남은 가족들이 할 수 있는 일은 몇 가지 되지 않았다. 실종 신고를 내는 것, 주변을 뒤지는 것, 아무나 붙잡고 이런 사람 보았느냐 묻는 것, 의류 쇼핑몰을 운영하는 남동생이 인터넷에 엄마를 잃어버리게 된 이유와 잃어버린 장소와 엄마의 사진을 올리고 비슷한 분을 보게 되면 연락해달라고 게시하는 것, 엄마가 갈 만한 곳이라도 찾아다니고 싶었으나 이 도시에서 엄마 혼자 갈 수 있는 곳은 없다는 것을 너는 알고 있었다. 글을 쓰는 사람이니 문안 작성은 내가 해라. 오빠가 너를 지명했다. 글을 쓰는 사람, 너는 해서는 안 될 일을 하다가 들킨 것처럼 기미치 붉어졌다. 과연 내가 구사하는 어느 문장이 잃어버린 엄마를 찾는 데 도움이 될지. 1938년 7월 24일생이라고 엄마의 생년월일을 적는데 아버지가 엄마는 1936년생이라고 했다. 주민등록상에만 38년으로 되어 있을 뿐 실제로는 36년생이라는 것이다. 너는 처음 듣는 얘기였다. 아버지는 그 시절엔 다 그렇게 했다고 했다. 태어나서 100일을 넘기지 못하고 죽는 아이들이 많아서 2, 3년 키워본 다음 호적에 올렸다는 것이다. 38이라는 숫자를 36이라고 고쳐 쓰는데 오빠가 신상 명세서이니 36년생으로 적어야 한다고 했다. 이건 우리가 만드는 전단지이고 여기가 동사무소나 구청도 아닌데 사실보다 등록된 것을 적어야 하나 의문이 들었지만 너는 묵묵히 36이라 적은 숫자를 다시 38로 고쳤다. 그러면 7월 24일이라는 엄마의 생일은 제대로 된 것일까 생각하면서
It's been 1 week since Mom went missing. The family is gathered at your eldest brother Hyung-Cheol's house, bouncing ideas off of each other. You decide to make flyers and hand them out where Mom was last seen. The first thing to do, everyone agrees, is to draft a flyer. Of course, a flyer is an old-fashioned response to a crisis like this. But there are a few things a missing person's family can do, and the missing person is none other than your mom. All you can do is file a missing person report, search the area, ask passersby if they have seen anyone who looks like her. Your younger brother, who owns an online clothing store, says he posted something about your mother's disappearance, describing where she went missing. He uploaded her picture and asked people to contact the family if they'd seen her. You want to go look for her in places where you think she might be, but you know how she is. She can't go anywhere by herself in this city. Hyung-Cheol designates you to write up the flyer since you write for a living. You blush as if you were caught doing something you shouldn't. You aren't sure how helpful your words will be in finding Mom. When you write July 24th, 1938 as Mom's birth date, your father corrects you, saying that she was born in 1936. Official records show that she was born in 1938, but apparently she was born in 1936. This is the first time you've heard this. Your father says everyone did that back in the day. Because many children didn't survive their first 3 months, people raised them for a few years before making it official. When you're about to rewrite 38 as 36, Hyung-Cheol says you have to write 1938 because that's the official date. You don't think you need to be so precise when you're only making homemade flyers, and it isn't like you're at a government office. But you obediently leave 38, wondering if July 24th is even Mom's real birthday. A few years ago, your mom said, "We don't have to celebrate my birthday separately. Father's birthday is 1 month before Mom's. You and your siblings always went to your parents' house in Cheongup for birthdays and other celebrations. Altogether, there were 22 people in the immediate family. Mom liked it when all of her children and grandchildren gathered and bustled about the house. A few days before everyone came down, she would make fresh kimchi, go to the market to buy beef, and stock up on extra toothpaste and toothbrushes. She pressed sesame oil and roasted and ground sesame and perilla seeds so she could present her children with a jar of each as they left. As she waited for the family to arrive, your mom would be visibly animated, her words and her gestures revealing her pride when she talked to neighbors or acquaintances. In the shed, Mom kept glass bottles of every size filled with plum or wild strawberry juice, which she made seasonally. Mom's jars were filled to the brim with tiny fermented croaker-like fish or anchovy paste or fermented clams that she was planning to send to the family in the city. When she heard that onions were good for one's health, she made onion juice, and before winter came, she made pumpkin juice infused with licorice. Your mom's house was like a factory. She prepared sauces and fermented bean paste and hulled rice, producing things for the family year-round. At some point, the children's trips to Cheonguk became less frequent, and Mom and Father started to come to Seoul more often. And then you began to celebrate each of their birthdays by going out for dinner. That was easier. Then Mom even suggested, let's celebrate my birthday on your father's. She said it would be a burden to celebrate their birthdays separately, since both happen during the hot summer, when there also are two ancestral rites only 2 days apart. At first, the family refused to do that, even when Mom insisted on it, and if she balked at coming to the city, a few of you went home to celebrate with her. Then you all started to give Mom her birthday gift on Father's birthday. Eventually, quietly, Mom's actual birthday was bypassed. Mom, who liked to buy socks for everyone in the family, had entrusted a growing collection of socks that her children didn't take. Name, Park So-nyeo. Date of birth, July 24th, 1938, 69 years old. Appearance, short, salt and pepper, permed hair. Prominent cheekbones, last seen wearing a sky blue shirt, a white jacket, and a beige pleated skirt. Last seen, Seoul Station subway.
Lovely. Thank you, Kyung-Sook, and thank you, Deborah, for reading. It occurs to me that Kjersti's book is about a self asserting yourself into and through a community, and this is a book about extracting or identifying a self that is lost and overly enmeshed in a community in some ways. Please look after Mom. This book is available now in English?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. And I wanted to note that all of our authors' books and many others are available at the Standard Hotel for sale after the event. Very good. Lewis Hyde, it's our third presenter. Very grateful to have him here. Lewis is a poet, essayist, translator, and cultural critic who has helped shape and define what he calls the public life of the imagination. His books include The Gift, an illumination and defense of art distinct from commerce, Trickster Makes This World, a celebration of disruptive intelligence through history and mythology, and most recently, Common as Air, which is a spirited case for our cultural commons, that vast store of ideas, inventions, and works of art that we have inherited from the past and continue to enrich in the present. A MacArthur Fellow, Lewis is Professor of Creative Writing at Kenyon College and a faculty associate at Harvard's Berkman Center for Internet and Society. So please welcome Lewis Hyde.
So I didn't bring something to read. I'm going to just talk about solitude as part of this solitude and community tension that we're trying to think about. I did recently write an introduction to a new translation of Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. So Penguin Books in London has brought this out, translation by a guy named Charlie Luth. And so Rilke was a famous theorist of solitude, and my remarks are going to be partly about my sense of what Rilke does and also its overlap with my own experience. And so the first question about going into solitude is, what is it you're moving away from if you are trying to be alone? And as an adult, mostly what I'm trying to move away from is distraction. We are surrounded by things that divert us from our work. But I think as a young person, both for me and it's clear in Rilke's letters, that there's a question about becoming yourself. And Rilke in particular, I think he lived in two fears. When Rilke went to Paris as a young man to work with Rodin, He was terrified by Paris, and particularly by the poor people he saw. And it seems to me that what was going on was that Rilke could see himself in that position, that he imagined that it was possible for him to just disappear into the crowd and be lost in that way. The second fear, another way of being lost for Rilke, was to be bound up in convention. And he has a wonderful line in the letters. He mentions the way in which most people, faced with the difficulties of sexual love, escape into one of the many conventions which, like public shelters, are set up along this most dangerous of paths. I love that image. It's like in New England they used to have huts on the beach, and if your ship was wrecked you could get to shore and take refuge in this hut. But Rilke's sense is that the conventions such as marriage are refuges which will help you take shelter from life itself. And he actually did get married, but he and his wife almost never lived together, and they farmed out their daughter to the wife's parents. But to say this another way, I think for a lot of young people, the risk is to too quickly go into whatever institutions are available, to take a job, or to get into a marriage before you really know who you are and have settled on what it is you are. And solitude is one of the places where you might begin that work of self-discovery. So I think of solitude in the Rilke case as the alembic of personhood, where an alembic is like the vessel that the alchemists used to use to consolidate the chemical. So there's a task of individuation that solitude might be directed toward. Another way of thinking about this is I think all cultures have had traditionally a custom of sending the young into silence or into the wilderness. And the sense being that you cannot become a person until you have spent some time in nature or the wilderness or in absolute silence. And there's a wonderful line in Henry Thoreau, who's an American example of somebody who went into relative solitude. Thoreau says, "Silence is audible to all men. She is when we hear inwardly," page 2 is missing. Sound is when we hear outwardly. So in a sense, what one wants to do is to go into silence so as to hear some other voices. And for Thoreau, I think, one of the fruits of his retreat at Walden was to be able to finally go before his townspeople and explain why he was a tax resister. And so that would be an example of somebody who's translating the voice of silence into a public voice. I'll come back to this a little bit at the end. So when I set out to think about Rilke's own lessons on this, I decided to claim that there's a sort of geography, a journey, a path that he recommends to Capus, the young poet he's writing to. And the first, so I've made up a list. It changes every time I reread it, but the first thing apparently is the simple recognition that of how alone you are. And for Rilke in particular, he'd been sent to military schools by his parents, and I think particularly for somebody with a gift that is not the gift that the other people in your class have, that it's painful. And the temptation is to just ignore your own gift or suppress it. But for Rilke, the demand is to say, well, okay, I am alone in this thing I'm trying to do. And so you can see in the letters, he has letters to other people at the same time he's writing to Capus. And he's writing to this young guy, and he's claiming, you must know you're alone. And it's as if Rilke himself knows that. But it's clear from the other letters that this was a real struggle for him to come to this recognition and to say it. And I think another thing about the way Rilke works is that he had a great talent, which is a spiritual talent, for inverting negatives and making them into positives. So we had this afternoon discussion, and somebody had a wonderful quote from May Sarton, that loneliness is the poverty of self, and solitude is a richness of self. So you could say, so we have these two English words, but in a funny way, what I think Rilke is able to do, and what anybody who has this spiritual intelligence is able to do, is to realize that the poverty and richness are related, that you can invert poverty. and that you can take your aloneness not as a negative but as a positive and embrace it. And so that's what Rilke does. A line I found recently, apparently it's psychoanalytic wisdom, is that it's useful if parents can teach their children how to be alone, because if they don't, they will always be lonely. And I don't know quite what it means to teach your children to be alone, except one thing was mentioned in the afternoon discussion was the analyst Winnicott has an image of the child being able to play by himself or herself while the parents are doing something else, sort of humming in the background. That may be the simplest thing you can do. Rather than intruding on your kids and saying, "You okay? Are you all right by yourself?" Or flooding them with your own anxiety, somehow leaving them alone but knowing that they're safe. I myself prefer solitude with my loved ones, safe someplace else. But I want to have loved ones. So the first thing is this recognition, and the recognition in Rilke is a kind of inversion of what you thought was a negative into a positive. The second stage in this journey I'm calling is that I believe that there are guardians who try to keep you from being solitary. And they are, it's like as if in Tibetan Buddhism, there are these monstrous statues that they put outside the temple or something. And my own experience has been that particularly when I was younger, when I spend periods alone, I often, at the beginning of it, fall into a depression. And here's a thing from Rilke. This is the woman who loaned him this place to work when he did the Duino Elegies. And she reports, when he begins, a great sadness befell him, and he began to suspect that this winter would fail to produce anything. And then Rilke himself writes to her, and he says, "Things must first get bad, worse, worst, beyond what any language can hold. I creep about all day in the thickets of my life, screaming like a wild man and clapping my hands. You would not believe what hair-raising creatures this flushes up." But the guy could write. I think there's a whole list of these minatory guardians which try to keep you from going into the process of whatever it is that's solitude. One of the others is fear that if you do this, people will stop loving you. That if you go off by yourself, your family will abandon you and so forth. And the collective has a great interest in keeping you from solitude. Because you're likely to discover something the collective doesn't know. So they will say, "Oh, if you go off by yourself, we'll never see you again. We actually will sell your clothes to strangers and we'll give your room away." And so there's a whole list of these things. And I say this because what that means is, well, first of all, you often hear writers say, "Well, you just get up in the morning at 4:30 and write for an hour, and then you'll get your novel done in a couple of years." This has never worked for me, because for me to do serious work, there is at least 2 days of non-serious work where I go through all this stuff. And that means if I only have an hour, I never get to it. And so I need long periods. But you also therefore need enclosure of some kind. You need some sort of ritual container within which this can happen. Because without that, you will, as Rilke suggests, run screaming from the things that threaten you. So what happens at the other end of this sitting with your demons? 2 things to say. One is, I think, from my own experience, is that coming out of this amounts to a kind of flat acceptance of the fact that this is the work you're going to do. People often talk about how exciting it is to be a writer or something. This is not my experience. A friend of mine says, "If it's so wonderful, why do writers put it off?" I mean, we all do. I'll do that next week. But there's sort of flat acceptance. And I was mentioning earlier, there's a poem of Gary Snyder's that I think of in this regard, called "Why Log Truck Drivers Rise Earlier Than Students of Zen." And it's a short description of driving trucks up into the mountains to carry logs back. And at the end of it, it just says, 30 miles of dust. There is no other life. And my own experience is on the other side of whatever moods I have going in is a kind of, okay, my sense often is that I have nothing to say. But at any rate, it's all, or I have a very tiny thing to say, so it's all I have, and I forced myself to be alone for 3 days, so I'll sit down and do it. So there's a kind of flat acceptance. In Rilke, this is a period of patience. And this is something he learned from Rodin, that the sculptor Rodin, he had been a secretary to Rodin, and he felt that Rodin had great patience. So patience is just, actually in this little essay I wrote, I say, patience is practiced in the present. It is the art of courting the future. It belongs to becoming rather than being, to the unfinished rather than the completed. It is not so much suited to heroes as to invalids and convalescents, those who must wait. So we have a story of a convalescent here. I think you were forced into patience. So there's a kind of waiting or attentiveness that has to happen. And then actually, I'll just say two more things. There's a wonderful little detail about Rilke working on the Duino elegies. And that is, so he spent the winter in this castle, and he was not getting anything done, and it was horrible, and he was sad and depressed. And then there's a day when he gets this, in the biographies it's called, he gets a tedious business letter, and he has to spend the whole morning working on these figures and replying to this letter. And then he goes down to walk along the beach or something with this tedious business letter in his head. And then to his surprise, he hears a voice. And the voice speaks to him the first line of the first Duino elegy. And now what's of interest to me here is the tedious business letter. Because like in the Letters to a Young Poet, he never says to young Capus, and then you must find some tedious, dull thing to do. But there's a puzzle about patience and acceptance. The puzzle is how to practice intended non-intention. So you're in a state where at some level you've given up on what you're going to do. You don't have any ambition. And yet your situation is such that you sit with it. And in this context, to my mind, it's the distraction, the thing you didn't think you were going to do. It takes your mind away from whatever's going on. And in that absence, then something else can perhaps happen. So, in physics, there's all this stuff about catalysts, and apparently you drop palladium into a carbon mixture, and the carbon atoms will happily join together. The palladium does nothing. It's not bound up in the final atom. It just is there. And so it's as if these somehow you need to find some tools for intended non-intention that will be triggers for other things. Though, of course, you can't do it too intentionally. So the last thing I want to say is that I think that solitude is, in fact, a social state. And that I heard a Zen teacher once say, in the practice of meditation, you first work on yourself, and you can't work for other people unless you've done that. He says it's like that lesson on the airplane when they say, so if the plane starts to go down, these oxygen masks will drop, and put your own on before you help other people. So apparently, before you can do something actually social, and before you can act on your affection for other people, you need to feel affection for yourself. Before you can care about the community, you need to be a person. Actually, I love your invocation about death. Well, I actually think that solitude includes the meditation on death. I had some train of thoughts. The tedious business letter is upon me. It's about Rilke. That Rilke's other fear. He thought that the one problem with the modern world was that people didn't die their own deaths. That people died statistical deaths. That you died of cancer or you died of something like this. And to die your own death, you had to first become a person. And unless you had become a person, you couldn't die. And he has a fabulous, sad letter about his mother. And basically what he says is, this woman never knew who she was, and she will never have her own death. The train of thought here is to try to think about the social aspect of solitude. And my own experience has been that actually I begin to feel closer to the people I love and with whom I'm in conversation when I'm alone. And sometimes I write letters, more letters when I'm alone than when I'm not. I begin to go out. But to speak of other people, again, I mentioned Henry Thoreau. People think of Thoreau as a classic isolato, which he was, but you forget that writing and publishing is a remarkably social act. To finally gather your thoughts and write them out at length and get them to the printer and publish them, which is what Thoreau did, is a social act. And so for him to publish Resistance to Civil Government, Civil Disobedience, is a social act, which then finally speaks to Gandhi and speaks to Martin Luther King. And or another way of saying this is, if the problem of the young who have not yet had the experience of individuation that solitude might give, maybe if you have that, then finally you can get married, or you can enter a profession that you care about, and you'll be able to possess it as something your own, that you can live in without having to feel that you've lost and become invisible. So solitude is social. I'm going to end there. This is a little map of that.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Lewis and all three of you. So one of the things that we do in Arts in Mind that is special is bring creative artists together in conversation with authorities on creativity and psychology who come to it from the perspective of the mental health world. Ordinarily, in the rhythm of our events, I would turn to my partner, Jerry Fromm, for his reflections, and he's not able to be here because he's terribly ill, but he has sent some thoughts, and I'm just going to read a few of his words and summarize a few things, his observations on this topic. For them, solitude degenerates quickly into unbearable loneliness, in which one's only preoccupation is where the other person is, or abject aloneness in which it seems impossible to make contact with other people. It's this latter state of profound isolation that sometimes leads people to hear voices. This is, to me, one of the most discerning psychological comments I've heard in a long time, is to connect this very ordinary experience to this experience that many of us regard as very other. That this hearing voices comes out of this terrible isolation, which Jerry says, I take to be a phenomenon of extreme aloneness. I spoke to someone recently who said that in such a state, i.e. hearing voices, she reached out to others in ways they could not understand. So they were frightened and withdrew even more. She was understandably both panicked and despondent. This is fun because I get to both read and annotate Jerry at the same time. But I think that we have alluded to this virtuous circle of solitude leading to social connection, and it's very, I think, very helpful to see this, malevolent circle of the way that solitude can lead to social disconnection. That from a place of intense discomfort and loneliness, we have experiences that make us even more socially awkward, or even, in some cases, repellent, which leads to greater isolation. And I think to see these things together is very important. Jerry goes on that he's guided by the pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, who has this idea of the capacity to be alone, very much connected to our development in early childhood. He said, well, let me read this. He says, Winnicott once commented that the capacity to be alone depended on the experience in early childhood of being alone in the presence of another. There is a paradox here, Jerry says, but a very ordinary one. We so often see children allowing themselves to be absorbed in creative play because the hum of a parent's activity is going on around them. I love that image of the hum earlier in this workshop, someone said that their favorite place to write, their favorite place to feel connected and also in their own space is a coffee shop in some foreign land, hearing the music of these voices that they can't understand. And I was thinking about that as Kyung-Sook read, so connecting and at the same time a very free space for my mind to go, especially knowing that the translation is coming. But Gerard goes on to say, what would happen to these children without that hum? This way of thinking leads to the question of what conditions make solitude bearable and what anxieties it makes difficult to achieve. Now, community. It has amazed me over the years how much the need to belong can motivate people, even people who have great difficulties with other people, to find a way to manage themselves such that they can hold on to their membership. How they clearly thrive so much in finding their voices to speak their own experience, and how hearing from others radically diminishes their isolation and, as someone once said, shrinks their experience to life size. It's so fascinating to hear this in the context of mental health, because we might actually have an adverse reaction to that idea of our experiences being shrunk in the context of creativity, when so much of what we want to do is give space, I think, to an impulse that may be quite grandiose. But of course, in the context of mental health, that's precisely what we need to be brought into a very ordinary and humble human relation. Jerry says, communities like this help troubled people re-enter the human community, but there's always the shadow side as well, how in a charged context, people project their own negativity or insecurity onto a vulnerable member, and how pressures to conform and avoid differences lead to encounters that feel both intense and inauthentic. So there may be a question here about how literary communities support deep work, in Winnicott's terms, how the true self can be defended from the false self functioning that sometimes happens in groups. There's a bit more of Jerry's on this, on how to reconcile loneliness and community, that I'm going to withhold for the end. But I think he's speaking very beautifully to this question, of how we disrupt this, problematic circle and enhance this virtuous circle of solitude leading to community, a kind of solitude and aloneness, even a loneliness, even a desperate loneliness that leads us to create something, the very purpose of which, of course, even if we somehow have brought ourselves into a state of not thinking about it, there's a social purpose underneath it at its core to creating. And I think even, it's what is creativity? Creativity is different from novelty, it's different from something new by virtue of its reception. And you could define creativity as being something that's being accepted by the gatekeepers of a domain, as Csikszentmihalyi does. For me, the psychologist George Vaillant, who I've written about, I proposed to him that definition of creativity. He said he's in the right direction, but he's not quite there. He said, you're being creative whenever you do something that makes someone else cry, or laugh, or engenders an emotion. And I took from that a definition of creativity that's part of my working dictionary for my book, that creativity is producing something that is recognized by at least one other person. And I'll just, as we're sort of talking about this virtuous circle, I'll throw out one more quote and then let's get into conversation. From Mikhail Bakhtin. I cannot do without the other. I cannot become myself without the other. I must find myself in the other, finding the other in me. And with that, does anyone in the audience want to kick us off with some questions? Yeah, Lisa Lewis. Hi, Lisa.
I wanted to say that your book and the topic of losing a mother just made me, and then actually what all of you were talking about sort of brought something for me, and that is that I lost my mother when I was 13, and that was 33 years ago. And there is a loneliness of not having a mother that I still experience now, and it has to do with those little, like the hum that you were talking about of, you know, the rituals, preparing meals, the simple stuff of life. But now that I am a mother and I have 2 young children, being a mother has made me crazy because there's so much pressure that I've lost the ability to have the solitude that I need. And I can be alone, but my kids know where I am, and if I walk out the door, they want to know where I'm going, and it does drive me crazy. And it's something that you don't understand until you become a mother. But it just brought it together for me, hearing about the description in your book about losing the mother and all those little things that they're thinking about of her. And I just wonder what made you write about this experience, and if you're drawing from your experience of being a mother or losing your mother, or the cultural experience of how the mother does not have her own identity. And this, by the way, is very much about Austin Riggs, of where I work. And being a mother, the mother is to blame. You know, there was a joke at Riggs that it's always the mother to blame, and the pressure of motherhood is great.
Yeah. Oh, geez, I've been asked to summarize the question for the microphone. Yeah.
What was your experience in reading these characters in the story?
I'm going to hope that the mic picked that up, because I'd like to leave the dignity of the words.
너무나 충분히 지금 질문하신 분의 마음을 이해해요.
She says she really understands, you know, where you're coming from.
저는 지금 지독하게 외로워요.
Right now, currently, I am very, very lonely.
지금 이 순간.
Right at this moment, actually. I'm sure you know why.
말을 알아듣지 못해서
Because I
외롭습니다.
cannot understand what's going on right now.
그런데 이런 생각을 합니다. 제가 한국에서 한국어로 아주 서로 잘 알아듣는 말을 할 때도 지독하게 외로웠어요.
But sometimes I think about this. Even in Korea, when I could understand the language, I was still very lonely in the midst of that language that I understand.
그때는 너무 잘 알아들어서 너무 많은 걸 알게 돼서 외로웠고.
I think at that time I was lonely because I was understanding too much.
지금은 또 못 알아들어서 외롭습니다.
And now I'm lonely because I can't understand anything at all.
그러니까 제가 이런 말을 하는 이유는 어떻게 생각하면은 외로움이나 고독이나 이런 것은 어떻게 해결할 수가 없는 정말 숙명 같은 것이 아닌가 이런 생각이 듭니다.
And the reason why I say this is because I think that loneliness is something that that cannot be. There's no answer for it. Therefore, it is like destiny to be lonely.
근데 외롭지 않으면 불안하거든요, 저는.
But for me personally, if I'm not lonely, I actually become very nervous.
어떤 모든 일이 너무 잘 되고 행복한 날들이 계속되고 이러면 이래도 되나? 이게 지금 마땅한 일인가 이런 생각이 듭니다.
Because I think if things are just going so well and I'm very happy, I feel like is this right? Can I continue this way? Is this gonna when is this gonna end?
그래서 지금 이 자리에서 일어나는 이 외로움을 사실은 속으로 즐기고 있었습니다.
So right now I was actually enjoying the solitude that I was being in this situation right now.
이 엄마에 대한 이야기도 역시 이 외로움 때문에 써졌다고 생각합니다.
And therefore I think I wrote this book because of that loneliness as well.
나는 아주 엄마를 잃어버리진 않았지만 엄마하고 15살 때부터 떨어져 살기 시작했습니다.
I never lost my mom, but I lived apart from her from the age of 15.
그렇게 엄마하고 헤어질 때는 이렇게 오랫동안 엄마랑 같은 집에서 사는 날이 없을 줄 몰랐어요.
After I parted with her, I never thought that I would actually be living apart from her for that long of a period of time.
인생이 그렇게 흘러가더라고요.
Life just sort of went like that.
어느 날 저희 그 15살 때 이야기인데 그때 제 꿈은 작가가 되는 거였습니다.
So this is a story of the time when I was 15, and at that time my dream was to become a writer.
엄마하고 어느 1978년 6월 10일이었어요.
It was 1978, June 18.
밤기차를 타고 서울이라는 곳에 왔습니다.
So I took the night train and came to this place called Seoul.
엄마가 옆에 앉아 있었어요. 저를 서울에 데려다주기 위해서.
And my mother was sitting next to me to take me to Seoul.
기차 아주 늦은 밤이었기 때문에 기차 차창 밖으로 이렇게 엄마 얼굴이 보였습니다.
And so because it was late at night, I was able to see the reflection of my mother on the train's window.
바로 앞에 앉아 있는 엄마를 이렇게 보는 게 아니고 이 차창으로 이렇게 보면서.
Even though my mother was sitting right in front of me, I was looking at a reflection through the window.
엄마가 너무나 피곤하고 고단해 보였기 때문에.
And the reason why is because she looked so tired and fatigued.
15살이라 어렸는데도 외로웠어요. 그 엄마를 보는 마음이.
And even though I was only 15 at the time, just looking at her just made me really lonely.
그래서 내가 언젠가 작가가 되면 저 외롭고 고단해 보이는 엄마에게 바치는 그런 헌사 같은 작품을 써보리라 이런 생각을 했습니다.
So at that time, I thought if I become a writer, I will write a story dedicated to my mother.
그때의 이 작품의 씨앗이 뿌려졌다고 생각합니다.
So I believe that the initial seeds were grown from that time.
그렇게 헤어진 세월이 길어지면서 저는 엄마한테 이제 딸이 아니고 어떤 손님 같은 존재가 됐어요.
And so being apart from my mom for that long of a period, I actually became more like a guest rather than a daughter to her.
그때도 역시 그 거리감, 메꿔지지 않는 어떤 거리감 때문에 너무 저를 애롭게 해서 아마 이 작품을 쓰는 그 힘이 되지 않았을까 생각합니다.
And so I think that distance, that loneliness I felt from that distance from her, I think that became the motivation for me to actually write the story.
이 작품 안에는 지금 질문하신 분이 느끼는 그런 마음들도 많이 들어있다고 생각합니다.
And I also feel that in this story, the things that you felt personally, I believe that all that is in the story.
근데 엄마의 어떤 역할 같은 것은 어떻게 해결될 수 있는 문제가 아니고 어떤 순환이라고 봐요. 정말 계절이 바뀌는 것처럼 너무나 자연스러운 그런 순환인 것 같습니다.
But I believe that the role of a mother isn't something that we could actually, come up with some sort of answer. I believe it's just it's a cycle.
아마 분명히 지금 질문하신 분이 가지고 있는 엄마로서 갖게 되는 그런 억압 이런 것에서 해방이 되어도 또 외로울 거예요.
And I believe that even though the pressure of being a mother, you're relieved from that at one point, you will still probably feel lonely.
아마 그때는 해방이 되어서 외로울 겁니다.
And I'm sure you'll feel lonely because you are relieved from that pressure.
저는 이 작품을 쓰는 일로 그 외로운 순간들, 그 고독한 순간들을 견딥니다.
And for me personally, by writing, that's how I manage my own loneliness.
대답이 되었으면
I
좋겠습니다.
hope this satisfied your question.
Beautiful answer. Yeah. And this loneliness that you may feel, it might well be the prelude to the kind of, attended to with patience could lead us into what Lewis was discussing as the sort of the preconditions of creativity. I also just wanted to observe that, when Kjersti and I were corresponding, she in Oslo, me in Los Angeles, we were talking about this presentation, and she said, "I look forward to having fun talking about loneliness." And I wrote back that might well be a definition of a nice definition of literature, self-consciously echoing David Foster Wallace, who talked quite a lot about loneliness, fiction as an antidote for loneliness. But this exchange, it feels to me as though it embodies that, because here two people with this experience of loneliness finding communion, and I don't know if you describe it as fun, but certainly it's affirming and warm. And what's that?
We had some whiskey.
Yeah. Loneliness plus fiction plus whiskey equals fun. Many questions. Yeah, Damien.
Josh, I really liked what you were saying about the two different cycles, that there's returning fortified with richer relationships to the social world, but then there's the bad version where you are creepy and you like turn people off and that just isolates you more and then you just become more desperate and creepy. So my first reaction was that I liked seeing those two circles in different directions, but my second reaction was that it's actually kind of hard sometimes to tell those two apart. I know that, you know, in the sort of messy real world, it's rarely quite as glorious as a self-reliant Emersonian messiah to the community, or conversely, you know, being in a mental hospital and creeping everyone out. I thought of this kind of Gray Rilke thing because of Lewis Hyde's talk. He has a diary entry, which is sort of a little short story about himself in the third person, where he says finally he's realized the most terrible mistake he's been making, which is actually caring what other people think and accepting the love that they're trying to shower on him. He should have just been chaste and pure and not cared about all these passersby trying to love him and he compares himself to a grave that people throw these flowers on, and it's just so terrible because he just has to sit there and take it, and there are too many flowers. And he says, he's 37 years old when he writes this, and he says, in his 38th year, he finally realized, how did he get to his 38th year without being hard? Change, he told himself, change. Become a hard person and just impervious to all of this. So is that the good cycle or the bad cycle? And I guess I'm not asking that specifically about Rilke, but I was thinking maybe you could muddy up the two cycles and see, I mean, are they the same or are they really different? You want to summarize that?
You know, I think that I'm hoping that the mic got that. I want to ask everyone who asks questions to do this, to project as loudly as you can, because we're in conversation here, and these, I think, are difficult to summarize. I mean, I'll say to you, Mike, that we have a question about these two cycles, what I've called the malevolent and the virtuous cycle, and the complication telling the difference between them. I mean, I want to first just confess that, I mean, this is not something I have observed abstractly, that what Jerry describes feels very much a part of my daily life, being, you know, overwhelmed with longing to the point of profound awkwardness, and sometimes, just social clumsiness, but what's more extreme than clumsiness? I mean, social, absolute social bungling that is sometimes minor and can be eased over, and sometimes has cost me relationships that I really didn't mean to lose. I was trying to do something social, but I lost my way, and this, fear of sort of tumbling is certainly one that's ever present. I feel very lucky to at least have some facility with language to be able to return to the page, because at least there you can, I think a lot of what writers do is, work over this longing into, from a place of total incoherence, hopefully to a place of at least, some coherence until it can be presented and gain the assistance of colleagues and friends, and sort of getting it to a place where you actually can make some communication. I forget who defined writers as those for whom writing is harder than others. And I think the idea is that people who are drawn, who are so full of that longing that they're prepared to do that work in isolation. And so, if your question is how do you tell the difference, or can you tell the difference? I mean, on the one hand, I would say clearly yes, because it's palpable, the way a loud ringing bell is palpable when you've done something socially awkward. I mean, you can often feel people physically withdraw. You certainly can tell when the emails stop being returned. But it's also, I think, very ambiguous because, number one, in just ordinary social situations, sometimes it turns out you're wrong. Sometimes it turns out a few days later, this person comes back and has been thinking about what you said. And certainly over the history, as we regard great art, a lot of it is regarded as totally mad in its time, and over time, is taken as a communication. Great question, and one I certainly want to think about. I want to see if Lewis has anything to chime in on that question or theme.
Well, this distinction, I think, particular personalities have particular relationships to these categories, and Rilke seems to me to be the one mark of Rilke's intelligence was a kind of uncontrollable negative capability. That is to say, he really identified with whatever was around him in a way that actually hurt him. And so, for example, there's a description in one letter. He's in Paris and he's out walking, and he sees a guy who has a nervous disease called St. Vitus dance, and everybody else is ignoring this guy. But Rilke is captivated. He can't take his eyes off him, and he essentially suffers the guy's suffering. And he was headed to the library, and he says, I had to go home. What book in the library could deal with this? And so you have a sense of a guy who was almost too porous, too open to the world. Or, it was his talent, but at the same time, for him, the demand was to harden the skin. Whereas for other people, other writers, the demand would be to open the skin. And so you have to, in some sense, begin with where you are, and then it'll take different paths. But that, part of Rilke's insistence on solitude has to do with his own difficulties with being in public.
Yes.
Hi. Well, fascinating discussion, and thank you all for that. What I wanted to
Project.
say is that I think I'm interested in your response to, first of all, what you just were talking about this kind of mirror analogy, because you're talking about Rilke basically being so over-empathetic that's why he needed a lot of solitude to be able to not be overcome. And I love all the paradoxes that keep popping up between solitude and loneliness and communality. And the one where I want to ask a question, which is on the internet. Is this bringing us closer together, or is this sort of putting us in this virtual dance where we're thinking we're having better community and connection and it's all virtual, but then what is that different than reading fiction? So I'd love to hear your comments.
The internet, good or evil? Or the internet as a facilitator or a disruptor of this virtuous relationship between solitude and community?
But I wasn't thinking about other things very much. Isn't that the great age lot? There's so much sort of forced parallel play. So you're going to live audience kind of coach parent and then the TV. But like so much of contemporary life is comes in being
What's the phrase you used, Alyssa? Forced? Forced?
Forced parallel.
And what's an example of forced parallel play?
Just that we're all in our own different bubbles of production, and it's not helpful.
Oh, I see.
Parallel work as humans, that's like a physics or social condition. All of the
The internet questions to me, seem unanswerable still, because it's really so new. And like any new medium that comes along, it takes decades or centuries to figure out how to domesticate it and make it our own and have right relationship to it. I've been involved with this think tank at Harvard called the Berkman Center on Internet and Society, and I was there for 6 years, at the end of which I have less and less to say about how to interpret the internet, because it's endlessly. But the one thing I would say from my own experience is that, first of all, I use, it's a fabulous and interesting tool. At the same time, when I talk about solitude at the beginning, one of the things one's trying to get away from is distraction. And so for me as a older writer, the internet is really just a distraction in almost all cases. And it's really like a cigarette or something. You know, I'm sitting there at my desk, I'm working, I have the slightest pause where I don't know what I'm going to do next. Well, I'll check my email. You know, that'll be the thing I do next. And an hour goes by and I lose it. So at some level, for me, I just want to turn it off when I'm really working.
Yeah, because we talked about that this afternoon. Why do we check our emails and why do we check the internet? But isn't it sort of human nature to try to find out what is going on around us, so that, like, for survival reasons, but we're...
I know, but it's become a parasite on our so if we have an instinct of what's going on around us, but it's actually sitting, the whole world is sitting on your desk, you know, then your instinct is backfiring.
Well, someone observed, I thought very helpfully, that someone was asked, what is the underlying impulse? And the underlying impulse is to know that you are being attended to, or to know that people are aware of you, are interested in you, and that actually can take us right back to Jerry's reference to Winnicott, which is this fundamental primary need. You know, I have a 16-month-old son, and I, you know, not because I've read Winnicott, but just because I'm, you know, I have other things to do when he's around. I'm cleaning up the kitchen or getting his food ready. He does a fair amount of play with me not watching him, and he, you know, I'm very blessed that he's got this very healthy rhythm of doing things on his own, and then he'll kind of toddle over and look up at me, and I look down and smile at him, you know, and that to me, it feels okay to me to leave him on his own. But that's the moment when I really want to be there. When he brings his attention to my eyes, I want to be there to smile, because that will then let him, you know, go off and explore all the more. And it seems to me, you know, we check our email, it's just a desperate feeling. I feel alone, I feel frustrated, I feel difficult. And, you know, there's something in the box, even if it's some listserv you've signed up for, you know, it's you're aware, some computer somewhere has your name on a list, you know, and maybe it's good news, or you know, then, or it's bad news, and that sort of spirals you into nothingness. I'll bring my remarks on this to a close. I just briefly want to say that it's the internet comes up over and over again as the #1 distraction and difficulty for creative people, and one of the fundamental sort of tools for creativity is you know, zeroing it out. There is a piece of software called Freedom that many of us creative people use that will block internet usage for any number of minutes that you insert. And artist colonies, many of them, fortunately, including McDowell, we found out this afternoon, still keep the internet out of their, you know, out of their residents' workshops. At the same time, I think, you know, it's in my life right now. My creative community, my core creative community right now is a writers group that meets via online conference. So there, you know, the tool is absolutely essential. I came to a point where I felt like I really needed a writers group, and it needed to be, I was like, who should it be? And I immediately thought of these two guys who were gonna be daring and push me, but also totally supportive and loving and fun to be with. And one's in Salt Lake City, and the other's in Kansas. So once a month, you know, we get together and see each other's, you know, pictures on the screen, and that works really, really well.
Did you use the internet when you were sick in the basement?
Yeah, I had it. Yeah, there was internet in the basement. Yeah, it was, but I didn't use it that much. Yeah.
Why not?
I don't know. I wasn't sort of addicted yet, I think. And I have experienced also that the more stressed I am, the more I check my emails and everything. Yeah. And I wasn't very stressed when I was in the basement. So I didn't feel, but when I do more things, then I check emails all the time.
One interesting thing that we're seeing at Riggs is that you know, 50% of the people at Austin Riggs have tried to commit suicide in the recent past, but it's an open hospital. And idea is that people use the community of other patients and staff when they're in trouble and they need help to come out and talk. But we're finding more and more that actually people are isolating in rooms and they're on Facebook. And they're not coming out to the nurses' stations to talk to people. But they'll put a notice of, they'll change their status to feel hopeless. In the rooms. And I mean, it's laughable, but it's happening. And there's other patients who are their friends who see this and don't know what to do about it. And it's disturbing. I mean, that your community is a virtue.
It's remarkable.
Not the people who are right around you.
Yeah. So I see that some folks are starting to drift away, and I also see some hands. It's 8:45, so we're going to continue for a bit. If you need to go, you can go, but we're going to keep the conversation going for just a bit longer. If you do leave early, I hope you will leave us with your name for the Arts and Mind mailing list, and continue to join us in the fall. We have some really terrific programs. We have a partnership with the Museum of Modern Art, and we're also going to do a big event around the publication of Spalding Gray's diaries with their editor, Nell Casey, and some special guests and friends of Spalding Gray, and some more stuff coming up in the spring. So please stay tuned. And also the Penn folks want me to encourage you to visit penn.org. See, today is Thursday, so Friday, Saturday, Sunday, there are many, many more programs as part of the Penn World Voices Festival. There was a question, the gentleman in glasses and then the woman in white.
Question is about the question of the value of solitude for one who's aspiring to be a writer and someone who's not aspiring to be a writer. It seems that there's a sort of conversation going on simultaneously, one being what is the value for a writer and what is the sort of universal value for all people. So I guess my question is, how can, for instance, a writer kind of reveal universal truths about solitude or about other things? Unlike most people, including their readers, and yet the sort of nature of writing, at least someone who considers themselves to be a polished author, is sort of going to live upon the prospect of reaping the fruits of that solitude. If that makes sense, that sort of patient becoming you were talking about earlier. The patient becoming can sort of assert the present being as value far easier when you've already got a book contract and literary agents. We know that, once you go into the pits of loneliness and solitude, you'll eventually be able to connect with someone because you're going to be able to publish that book, and that's going to be sort of the fruit of it. Whereas someone who likes to read, maybe, not read these books, but books of construction. What is the value of solitude for that man, as opposed to the person who has an art gallery or next month?
So I just want to make sure I understand. You're asking about sort of the importance of a network, a sort of professional network that exists to receive one's work, and the difference of the experience of solitude for that sort of person as opposed to someone who is not embedded in that kind of network?
Well, there's an apparatus that allows authors to connect with people, to be social, which is, in one sense, publishing. The apparatus of publishing, so that you go into solitude and you may suffer, but the fact that you know that there's a likelihood that your thoughts and reflections are going to be put into a book, and then connected with the readership, as opposed to someone who is also seeking the value of solitude, and yet their thoughts and reflections may not be found in the book, but rather they're going to wake up the next day and go back to their construction value.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say the question is about, it's as if we've been talking about solitude in a dedicated way, that it's for people whose project is finally to be writers or other works of art, will be at the far end of this thing. But what about solitude for somebody who has no such dedicated end? Did you want to say something?
Yeah, because that was what you were talking about finding out who you are, finding out that you need solitude to find out who you are, or your mind will think differently when you're by yourself. But I wondered about that when you said that, because being alone before you make a big choice like getting married or choosing the wrong career, but isn't marrying the wrong person and choosing the wrong education also a way of finding out who you are?
Yes, it is, and we've all done that too.
Yeah.
So let me answer this. Let me just say one thing quickly, and so I think, it's an interesting question, because in a certain sense, it sounds as if this is instrumental solitude as opposed to solitude for its own sake, and I would think actually that the other is the more interesting characteristic practice, and that that almost all spiritual communities have ethics of solitude or silence, and in which case I think the issue is again not to come out the other end with some product, but simply to know who you are, or to know to find out what happens if you're cut off from the distractions of social life, and what appears in silence. And it would be different, and I think anybody could benefit from this, and many people seek it who have no literary or other artistic intentions.
Can I just say a great Beckett quote?
Yes, please.
Because when we talked about Facebook and television and all these boring things, and he said, when the boredom of living is replaced with the suffering of being. And I think that when you're alone, you can sort of take in the suffering of being.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Sorry, who said that?
It's a
Beckett, but I don't know in what context he said it. I just stole it and thought
Beckett
it was great.
says, when the boredom of
living is replaced with the suffering of being.
the boredom of living is replaced with the suffering of being. That is ... Then we all dance. I want to come back to my role as a timekeeper and curator. One's head turns to mush when one is in the best kind of mush in these discussions, and I saw 8:45 and I saw, that's quite early, and I did not compute that we've actually been at this for an hour and probably 50 minutes by now. So I think we'll just take the one more question from you in just a moment, and then if you have more questions, please, rush to the front or rush to the people next to you and continue the conversation. I just want to add one thing that I'm really burning to say in response to that question about publishing, which is that I think my favorite example of the myth of the isolated genius in all of my research for this book I'm writing is Emily Dickinson, because we have such a clear and vivid image of her totally isolated, alone in her room, dressed in white, refusing the company of others. And this is very well documented that she did in fact do these things, and she did in fact, go to the extreme of actually talking to people from the other side of a door. And yet, when you look at Dickinson carefully, I think she's very much like the way that Lewis described Rilke as being immensely porous and affected. She's not cold and brittle. She's so affected by other people that she needs that space. And the reason, to bring it back to your question, people think of Dickinson having never published, but she actually used two different words in reference to the dissemination of work. She used the word printing and she used the word publishing. In her mind, printing was what we think of as publishing and what you would refer to having a book contract and being part of this enterprise. And publishing to her was sharing the work with an attentive reader. And in her mind, as I understand it, I'm not a scholar, but as I understand it from scholars, at least some scholars have made this argument, she was publishing by writing her poems and sharing them with other people by sending them in letters. And so I think, it's important that we not think of creativity in this context as something that's reserved for those who have book contracts with small or large presses or, involved in galleries, but is a social exchange that I think, at its very root can be brought down to an exchange with one other person. Ma'am?
I think I'm just adding to everything you're saying, but I think there's two ways you get to know yourself. One is through solitude, and the other is the interaction with people. And I think when you're in a solitary state, you're very peaceful. You're filled with the people that you love with, that you think about. So you're not really solitary. It's not like you're not not with people, you're just with people that you're alone with them in a different way. It doesn't surprise me that matters more than solitude. There was a movie by Tom Hanks that I can't remember, but he's on a desert island. Which is fantastic. Yeah. And he asked him to make a person, which he lives out on the wall, which I'm a psychoanalyst, who's provocative to the absolute primariness of needing a dialogue with someone outside yourself. And the curative aspect, in this case, I think it's just like there was another movie called Lars and the Real Girl. You know, Lars, where this guy gets loved up. And after comes this girl, and everybody pretends that she's real, and lo and behold, through this whole thing, he's able to actually find a real girl. And I think some of it, I read this thing on the internet, there's two people with avatars, that fell in love. So there are many ways to find this.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful observation, that we can find ourselves, through solitude, and also find ourselves through other people. And I think it gets to this circle that is, an image that has been returning to us, and also, the other image I took from Lewis's, talk is this. All of our talks about sort of pushing through, sort of pushing through this difficult space that may feel deadening, may feel like we're actually even worse than we were before, into some kind of release. What I was asking this group this afternoon, and I haven't really gotten an answer yet for, and maybe this is something we can all, leave to consider, is that moment when it changes, that moment when you move from, you're lonely, and the pressure is building, and you're, sick in a basement, and I think your parents were actually beating you too, right? They were, there were clubs that were, but seriously, that to be, and when that crack happens, and when the opening happens into something that is connected to ourselves or connected to other people, that to me, that's sort of the moment that I'm leaving this conversation very, very curious about. Kjersti, we haven't heard from you in a little while. Is there anything that you want to add as we wrap up? Okay. Thank you so much, Kyung-Sook Shin and Kjersti Skomsvold and Lewis Hyde, and thank you all so much for joining us in this wonderful conversation. Are there any housekeeping notes that I've neglected? Okay, well, thank you very much. Big round of applause for everybody.